Hello, you are very welcomed for the first discussion, the podcast discussion what we organize in the Center for Past, Present and Future of Constitutional and Legal Research of VIZJA University. I'd like to say you that my name is Dariusz Makiłła. I am Professor of Law in this university. On my front of my person's city is sitting Professor Marek Tracz-Tryniecki.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, Professor of Łódź University. And in the middle of our two persons is the great guest of our meeting. This is author of a very specific, a very nice book. What I like to present to here, it is the John Patrick Higgins, of course, and this is a book, The Hermeneutics of Polish-Lithuanian Constitutionalism, 1774 to 1792. And
thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
Glad to be here.
So, and we'd like to present this book, and of course, the most this presentation make our guest, of course, and we only prepare some questions, because one of these questions is, you know, that in my opinion, this book is not a constitutional history of the Commonwealth. It is a history of constitutionalism, ancient Commonwealth, or rather of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And in fact, in my opinion, this book is about the theory of constitutionalism in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was realized in a specific way, I know, through the acts and this everything what the background of this. And the theory of the constitutionalism in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is something new, you know, in the research, and it is for us very interesting to prepare this and to show what you. And of course, the next question is maybe also, can you explain us what caused you to interest in this matter, you know, the constitutionalism of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because it's the core of this question.
Okay, so I think you're right in the sense that it's not a strict historical work, nor is it a political science work. It's somewhere in the middle, and I think the thing we need to talk about before this question is kind of what's the difference between constitutional and constitutionalism, because I think this word constitutional is kind of more common, but this word constitutionalism, what it specifically means, is not. So the Constitution, as we know, most countries have it. It's some kind of document that kind of structures the legal system, the political system. We can think of the Constitution in some ways as the law of the law or the law of politics. But constitutionalism is kind of a slightly different question. It's maybe in some sense a deeper question, which is when you want to have this law of the law, what principles are you looking for? Where do those principles come from? Do those principles change over time? And so I found this kind of analysis to be present within some works. A Polish thought professor has written some books on the handwritten articles as well. Other Professor Tracz-Tryniecki has written books about political legal doctrine, but they weren't together quite in the same way, kind of put together as kind of one piece. And so that's what I try to do a little bit deeper. So a purely constitutional history would have been this act was written in this year and maybe why, you know, that maybe the specific context. A political history would be this is, you know, maybe the period of one king we say is one period, or we say the Jagiellonian period is maybe one historical period. But a constitutional history kind of looked at what are the principles that kind of bind the Constitution, where did these principles come from, and do they change over time? And in fact, I found with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they did evolve over time. I kind of came with three broad phases of the system, the constitutional system. Maybe we can get into specific a little bit later for that. And I was kind of motivated by that. I thought that there was a story here that needed to be told. And so, for example, I come from the United States, where this debates about what is the Constitution mean. We have different schools of thought living constitutionalism, originalism, textualism, common law, studies, pragmatism, all these different kinds of approaches that they kind of look at it this deeper. And I just felt that kind of deeper reflection of the theory behind the Constitution wasn't there in Poland. So I kind of set about to kind of do that. And that's what I tried to do both in my PhD work and then later in this book. As for why I got there, how deep do you want me to go back into my story of from the beginning, or kind of from the middle a little
Well, I
bit
think
here?
it's maybe a bit from the beginning. It will be very
Okay.
nice because this is very specific book, and this book is maybe something new, in the research, because the history of constitutionalism and the problem of constitutionalism, it is very lack of this in our history, and it was not treated in last year so much, and there are some books now that are trying to get these problems, but I think that this problem, what you touch, it is much more deeper in a greater sense, in a greater perspective made. So it is from this point of view, it is very, because it is something like a very complexity book about the constitutional history made from a specific point of view, from the acts and from analysis of these acts, of course. That
Yes.
is, of course, very important.
Yeah, the acts in dialogue with the context too, right? This back and forth between them. So where I first kind of became in love with, or kind of with this idea of Poland and studying Poland, is I did my master's work in America, and I started in sociology, and then I also did a master's in economics, and I had an advisor there who was a man from Romania, actually, and he was an expert in the post-Soviet transition, and so he encouraged me to do a project comparing why certain countries did better relative than others. So we see Belarus and some of the further east you go, usually the worse the transformation is, and you look at Poland, the Baltic nations, Hungary, Czechia, they've done relatively well in this process. And so the two main theories in economics and sociology, kind of from the American point of view, are also kind of very American centered, so to speak, is that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher run the Cold War, but they kept spending money until the Soviet Union had no money. And the other idea is that the Soviet Union kind of was a rotten system, and the foundations were too weak, and it got too big, and kind of these internal problems led it to collapse. And for me, neither of these hypotheses were fully there, because nobody asked the questions, well, what did Polish people feel about communism? And so then I noticed this pattern where the countries that seemed to have done better, Hungary, Poland, Czechia, the Baltics, etc., also had this long history of rejecting and fighting against Russian, Austrian, Habsburg, German, Prussian, whatever, imperialism over the last 100 years. So it's kind of this, maybe there's this sociological explanation where there's something about the spirit of the Polish nation or something about the Polish culture that's kind of deeper. And so I started with the 20th century, and I worked my way backwards all the way to the 14th century. And as I got more and more fixed, I saw more and more that there were these continuities from 1300 to from the pre-Jagiellonian period to the Jagiellonian period, and then from the Jagiellonian period to the this post-Jagiellonian period, and then we had this. Then the Wettin period had some problems, but we still see this continuation, and then all the way to this day. So there's this kind of idea of deeper links and continuation. And if you look also, for example, in this 1997 constitution we have today in Poland, in this preamble, it has this saying, we are kind of paraphrasing, we're rebuilding the Polish nation, taking from the best of our own past, our understanding our own past and understanding our own traditions. And I saw, okay, there is this historical space where there are people in Poland interested in kind of this deeper history of ideas, practices, institutions, and where they kind of come together. And so, for example, it was my deeper reading, I think it was your book, where I first had this idea, wait a minute, we have this 3rd May Constitution, we have this Henrician thing. In some sense, they're both constitutions, but maybe what they mean by constitution isn't the same. So what the word constitution, what it means, what a constitution was written, what the state looked like, state, society, politics, economy, in 1600, 1800, 2000 looked different. And then I said, okay, now we need to come up with this language that can kind of connect all these different ideas. And that's when I came to this idea. It's not a problem of constitutionalism. It's not a problem of the Constitution, but it's this deeper question of constitutionalism. And maybe there's some kind of deeper problems and to look into. And so it was a combination of looking for these ideas, looking for these connecting threads, and then looking through the texts, mostly acts of the same, but also statements by the kings, the privileges of the nobility, minutes of the Sejmiki, all these different things to kind of look for textual evidence to see these ideas, these meanings, these concepts are changing over time, and we can see how these changes are occurring. So that was kind of the basis for this kind of hermeneutics approach, was to take this context, but also this concrete evidence, and kind of find ways to kind of create a dialogue between these phenomena and look at how these ideas change over time.
Pat, you've just started to discuss the methodology, yes, and the sources, and the very, let's say, characteristic feature of your book is that you've adopted this originalistic approach, yes? Could you briefly introduce us to this concept, how you came to this idea, and to which branch of originalism you mostly adopt to refer in your book, and which you adopted during your researches on this Polish-Lithuanian early modern constitutionalism? And maybe let's start from this methodological aspect.
Sure. So I was trying to find this question, and why I turned to originalism. I was trying to kind of this question. It was, in some part, it was like a historiographical question. It was also this conceptual question. And so I wanted an approach that was both a method, but also a theory that they were strong in both. And so this is why, coming from America, I was always aware of originalism and kind of originalistic theories. And so I said, okay, originalism is this idea that the original text or the original meaning of the text should somehow guide future understandings of the text. That yes, law can change over time, but we should always be aware of where law came from and where the sources of law. And so I was thinking, well, this is what I'm trying to do in Poland. I'm trying to understand where they came from, but I have a beginning, I have an original text, and as I move through time, so the method just kind of naturally seemed to kind of follow. But as I've kind of mentioned, there are multiple schools or kind of approaches to originalism also, and I'll maybe very briefly go through them and kind of explain why I picked the one that I did. And so the first kind of originalism, 1970s, was this idea of the intentions of the founding fathers of the United States. So what did this is what they wrote, but what did they really think? And maybe we could look in the private minutes of the meeting. We have the notes from the Constitutional Convention. We have their letters. We have their public diaries. And so when they wrote these life, liberty, and happiness, well, what do they mean by liberty? For example, Jefferson wrote this, but he also owned slaves. So it's kind of a contradiction there. And so, but the problem with the intentions, though, is that the Constitution is a document where we know Madison wrote it, but Jefferson wrote the Declaration. How much did they talk? Is it like 2% by Jefferson, 5% by George Washington, 15% by Madison? It's kind of this impossible question to answer. So if you have a composite document, it's not like a piece of music where it's like, well, Beethoven wrote the whole thing, so therefore we get the answer. It's like 50 people in a committee come together and we don't know who said what. So it just doesn't work. And then they try to have the intentions. They try to look at the notes of the founding fathers, to contemporary documents at the time. And this gave birth to the second kind of phase of originalism, with Scalia as kind of the most known, prominent of this one, which was, you look at a document written in 1780 and it says taxation or it says freedom. Well, then you look at every other document written, say, within 1770 and 1790, dictionaries, other speeches, and say, kind of, what does this word mean? So it's all about the meaning of the words, and it just says, okay, this is what the word meant. Even if the word has changed its meaning 250 years later, we don't use today's meaning of the word. We use the original meaning of the word. So that's kind of this original public ideas. And the one that drew me, though, is what they call the third generation, which tries to be much more positivistic. And they basically say originalism and legal history is really a sub-branch of history, and specifically kind of this branch of legal positivism. And so there's Stephen E. Sachs is the one guy, William Bowd is the other. More Sachs was more important than Bowd in my work. And so Sachs has this paper that says originalism is a theory of legal change. And the idea is that if you can go back to the beginning and construct the beginning, and then you kind of look over time, you can see how it has deviated, but you kind of have this as a starting point. And so, for example, we say, look at a principle debate today with America, say like abortion rights or homosexual marriage or something like that. And then people will say, okay, marriage and abortion don't appear in the United States Constitution, but would they fall under these other kind of categories or not? And so some people say yes, and some people say no, but you say, okay, the Constitution starts here and it moves through time. And maybe they added some other theories to it, but those other theories are legitimate or they're not legitimate, but it's kind of takes this originalist approach and kind of grounds it with more of a historical approach, not a positive approach. So it borrows from other sciences more than just legal sciences. And one of the philosophers they cite is H.L.A. Hart, who is his work on, he calls it, I can't remember if it's primary and secondary or first, but it's this idea you have first rules and second rules. And the second rules are the rules about changing the rules. So we have to have these in day-to-day life. Law has to be stable, and the Constitution is like the rule behind the law. And so he says, when you change a Constitution, that also cannot be random. So that a Constitution has its, for example, the United States, we have an amendment process to the United States Constitution. Poland, they also had this, when the king cannot just write the laws however he wants to, the Sejm cannot just write the laws however the Sejm wants to, the king and the Sejm and the senators and everybody has to get together. So you have the laws, and then you want to change the laws, there's also a specific process for changing the laws. And so this was kind of this third way, or this kind of social positivist form of originalism is the kind of one that I specifically use. And so my kind of approach, and this is where the hermeneutics kind of came approach, is this idea of, well, where do you start? You have a legal system, you want to study where it changes, but how do you know where to begin and how to end, right? If you look at some hermeneutics approaches like existentialists or phenomenology, they can kind of, you start as from human beings, and then you're talking about, the being of the man of the being or whatever, right? And they're nonsensical and they don't work for legal systems. So I started with the Third May Constitution, because that's the ends, we could say, of the Republic. So if you want to look at the Republic, look at the last thing that they did, kind of as a good place, and work your way backward. And it just so happens that Article 2 of the Third May Constitution actually has a list similar to the 1997 has a list of here are honored forebears and ancestors that we're respecting. The Article 2 of the Third May Constitution actually says the articles according to, and it gives a list of all the kings and implies the legal acts. So it's you're able to work from there and kind of work my way backwards. So I kind of doing American originalism, and I actually had some emails with Sachs about this, and they said it was kind of interesting because their intention was you start from the American Constitution and work your way forwards in time, and I took the Third May Constitution and I went backwards in time. And they said they hadn't thought of it that way, but they didn't see any reason that it couldn't be, if you're doing this historical method, that they couldn't use this kind of approach. So that's kind of the method that I use to guide me.
But can you tell us what was so much interesting in the Polish constitutionalism for you? Because when you made this in a longer perspective, so you can, of course, compare this with the American English and something like that. What kind of the Polish constitutionalism was?
Well, it's kind of relevant in a lot of different levels. I think the first level, and I'll just be honest, it was kind of an interesting puzzle to solve, so to speak, right? And I just wanted to know more about it. and my intuition kept telling me to dig more and more. So there's not maybe that's in a little bit a rational point of view. But the other thing is when you read through these documents, you see that a lot of the solutions, a lot of the ideas, maybe they're not the exact same, but a lot of the ideas and solutions are similar or even the same. So this idea that the parliament, the Sejm, or the Senate, or Izba Poselska, whatever various form it's been in through history, they always have the power over money, and they always have the power over military. And so you see that in the French Constitution, you see that in the American Constitution, you see that in the Polish Constitution, and you say, okay, maybe there's something about this family of constitutionalism where they all came to the same kind of conclusion, the same kind of idea. And for example, they all see the king or the president as the person who has, like Montesquieu, where it's, the power to administer the law, but it's supposed to be kind of very narrow, that the president can't do whatever he wants, the king can't do whatever he wants, and we see the same puzzle here. So that's what was kind of fascinating, that so much of it seems so similar to what we have today. Maybe there's some kind of universal human kind of experience that if you took a Polish nobleman from 1630 and you introduced them today, they were already used to voting. They were already used to having a representative. Maybe they would adapt better than we think that they would. And the third thing was maybe unique, perhaps, to Poland, was kind of Polish republicanism. And so, for example, I remember learning about republicanism, and you learn from Aristotle that, and from elsewhere, or kind of, for example, American republicanism. American republicanism and French republicanism also was the idea of overthrowing the king. So in that sense, we see it today. So the People's Republic of China, it's an authoritarian system, but they don't have a king. North Korea says the same thing, that they're republican. So the kind of the modern sense of republicanism has meant no king. But if we look throughout history, and for example, also you mentioned maybe the British or English tradition, they also have a king. And there are constitutional monarchies in Europe that they have kings. But when you talk about the king of Sweden or the king of England, and you think about the king of Saudi Arabia, they're like king. They both use the word king, but it has a very different kind of meaning in this kind of context. And so I think when you look at the history of Poland and you hear the word king, you're like, oh, they must be like Henry VIII, where they're fighting, starting all these wars and they're doing whatever you want to. And then when you get deeper into the history, this balance of the king is a citizen, the king is the father of the nation, he's kind of the first among equals of the nobility, then you're like, well, perhaps this idea comes to you that perhaps the Polish constitutionalism was closer to modern, as we think of modern constitutional monarchy, closer to, and this is not just an observation by me. I think Butterwick has said this, and Lewandowska-Malec have said this, and other people have just kind of said this. But this is kind of just fascinating evolution of this idea of power, for example.
So, Pat, you've adopted, yes, this typically American methodology of this originalism, yes, using in the Supreme Court, yes, as one of the most important, let's say, tradition. And you found this, let's say, similarities, yes, which we could point as being characteristic for Poland. And now, could you briefly refer to what you could find as a weak and strong, let's say, points of this Polish-Lithuanian experience of constitutionalism?
Yeah, I'll try to answer both kind of weak and strong at the same time. Because so for example, there was this problem of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and as we know, it kind of collapsed, and a lot of it kind of proceeded from kind of internal division. So a lot of people say this golden liberty was a bad thing, and especially if you read, like Michał Brzezinski or like some of the Warsaw School, or the communists especially had very negative views, and they said the system was unstable, it was oligarchy, and it just kind of collapsed. But at the same time, coming from an American point of view, having a very decentralized government, having very strong. You didn't have states, but you had Mazovia had its own kind of identity that even under the king lasted was very strong. Parts of Silesia had its very strong identity. Duke of Prussia had had this very strong identity. So it's kind of similar in the way Lithuania, Ruthenia. So there were these parts, and they had kind of, even under the Kingdom of Poland or under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, they kind of still retained very strong local kind of traditions. So it's interesting because when I look at Poland, I said, oh, this is kind of very similar to what the American colonies started to look like. And if they hadn't been invaded, maybe in 100 years, they could have evolved into kind of something like a real federalist system. In fact, I kind of have something in my mind that I'm kind of working on and thinking about kind of as the next step, that this concept that somehow the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was something between this idea of a union, kind of as we think about like the United Kingdom today, and somehow, but still not quite federal, but it's some kind of this intermediary organ. So I would say that this decentralization of Poland was good in some sense, and in many ways, because you had your own culture, that the nobility many times, they had these rebellions, these Rokoszes or these Confederacja, where they wanted back and they pulled the king back from absolutism. But it's this kind of unfortunate irony in history where the absolutist countries survived and absolutist countries have a more powerful military. And so therefore, by having high levels of freedom in Poland, which we would see as a good thing, also weakened them up militarily, because if the king says, go invade that country, and you say, you don't have the right to say no, it makes it a lot easier to conquer other kinds of countries. So I think it's kind of both. And there's this kind of pattern that if you look at, for example, if you look at where this kind of republican traditions lasted the longest in Europe, you have like Switzerland, right? Switzerland, even today, is not really, it's kind of a confederation, not a federation. And then you also have England, which they also had, this glorious revolution where they overthrew their king and they had republican experiments. But Switzerland's protected by mountains, and England is protected by the channel. So if Poland had mountains around it or a channel around it, maybe they would have been able to take a different path. And if you look at Kołłąta and Staszic, when they were talking about the Third May Constitution, and you see their letters and comments and writings, they said, we wanted to be more radical than we were, and we're envious of America of having an ocean, because they have an ocean between them and Russia, and we don't. So I would say that maybe this kind of accident of geography. So I don't want to say, was it like a good idea but the wrong time? Maybe like this level of freedom, maybe in a different place and context, would have done better. But that's what I would say, that this kind of, and that's something I think Poland has lost a little bit with. Some of the linguistic diversity and the religious diversity and all these different groups were conquered, and Stalin removed some, or other groups kind of were shuffled around, that this kind of regional character that we have today in Poland is not nearly as strong as it was 200 years ago or 300 years ago. So I think that's something that Poland has kind of lost. But I'm not saying that Silesia should declare independence from Poland, or or something like this. But I think that's something that's from an American point of view. We have all these voivodeships in Poland, and I'm like, oh, this is like America. These are like different states, and they're really not quite the same. The regional governments don't have the same power as, for example, as in America. So, strength and weakness.
All right.
Yeah. So, but most very important and very interesting should be, maybe, if you could repeat it to us, what the change of different acts as the building of constitutionalism you choose and you found and you research.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, because the period of the book and the period of the PhD started a little bit differently, because where the acts are a little bit hard to find, but kind of the shorter version, and then we'll kind of get to more concrete acts later, is that there were these kind of local parliaments, the VIZJA, these kind of regional councils of the knights that began in Poland 1400s kind of onward that eventually they became the Sejmiki. And so in that sense, you have to say probably this nihil novi was kind of, so you I think you've persuaded very, very well that this Henrician Articles 1573 is a constitution. I think if we have a more looser kind of concept of constitution, if we want to be fair, I think nihil novi can also be seen as kind of this, as a constitution for its own time.
Constitution as an act, but I think that mostly it formed as principles.
Yeah.
But the former constitution, it was quite different, of course, but it was very, very important step on the way.
Yeah. So it's like it's a legal act versus a constitutional act. You also have maybe legal acts that are not constitutional, legal acts that are constitutional. So it's a little bit of play back there. So I think so there's definitely this nihil novi. Then you had this series of acts that they would not one particular acts, but they call them the execution sames in the 1550s, 1560s through the 1570s. And there was this movement called the executionist movement, where they were basically unhappy with the Jagiellonian dynasty. And they said, well, when we had these agreements with you, you said we were supposed to have all these freedoms and privileges, and they are inconsistent, or the king is giving privileges to his friends, or he says, I will make you a senator or make you a voivode as long as you support me, and these things like that. And it was essentially bankrupting the country. So there's multiple times that the parliament would gather together through the 1560s, 1570s. They fought against trying to divide the church, tried to divide the courts, tried to change the policy of the king. But then you had the big one was this Warsaw Confederation, right, 1573, where they, declared religious toleration was a right of everyone in Poland. That was a big one. This Henrician Articles was a very big act that came through there. That's 20. I looked it up earlier this morning. It's 21 different acts or principles within this Henrician Articles, or 21 articles, I should say, and that has principles again such as the kingdom is not his personal property. That, for example, his throne, his office is not him. That his heirs will not inherit automatically. It's a process of election, right? So that guarantees this idea of the sovereignty belongs to the people, the citizenship as a whole. So that's an important principle. It also reaffirms principles of religious toleration. It reaffirms the principle that the Sejm and the parliament controls the military, controls foreign affairs, controls powers of taxation, right? And that was an important principle, to take them away from the king, because if you look at Russia or other places like that, the king says the taxes are now 20%. And if you don't like it, we kill you, and then we take 20% of it anyway, right? And so that was a different thing. 1578 was this act, because the 1573, we can see this real division of parliament versus the king. But the 1573 established this idea of a tribunal. So now we actually see a tripartite system of government, 150 years before Montesquieu was talking about it, where we see an independent judiciary. There's the 1609 acts after this rebellion, Zebrzydowski's rebellion, which the new king Zygmunt III was not so interested in. Zygmunt August was not so interested in fulfilling the laws. They kind of forced him to actually obey his word. Am I going too?
Yes, I want to make a little notice, Patrick. I would like to ask you how you've been, what it was in fact, this old Polish constitution, ancient Polish constitution.
What was it? Well, it's
because this is what you also said one time, and this is written in this book very nice, that we have, of course, something like a different system, the system of different acts. We can use this very popular word now. It is, constitution made from different acts.
This polycentric constitution.
Polycentric constitution.
Yeah.
Because there you have, of course, in this route, you have such acts like Henderson Articles, and before this, you have this Nihil Novi Constitution. But it is constitution as not like a constitution, like as
Right.
an act of name of constitution. And there you have different other acts. And even if we can talk about these Henderson Articles that way, they have maybe very formal shape.
Hmm.
Anyway, they were developed, and it was given the other acts to fulfill this older
Yeah.
system, and this made this constitution effect. So it means that constitution is not the same that it should be only in one act
Yes.
form. It can be in different acts, of course.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of this debate as to like where did the modern constitutionalism begin? So, for example, when people think of modern constitutionalism, they usually begin with the big three, right? So Poland, France, and then if they know their history, America, France, and then if they know their history, they include Poland. And this kind of idea is that you had to have a written down document that says whatever happened beforehand, it's no longer valid. We're starting over again with a new constitution. But as we know, arguably speaking, the longest existing constitution in the world is the British Constitution, but it's an unwritten document, right? And so then it's kind of a question of, well, what's this interplay between unwritten versus written kind of constitutions? And so this idea of the polycentric constitution is that even if you have a document that's written down, say the American Constitution of 1787, there's so much in it, norms, ideas, values, the Bill of Rights, for example. A lot of it basically is the same ideas that was written in the Civil War, Glorious Revolution, 1688, 1689, right? So this idea, and so Poland had the same thing too, where this modern concept of one nation, one constitution, one government, one kind of clear hierarchy was not there. And so this idea of we had these Henrician Articles, but even when we had the Henrician Articles, it was more like an addition to the law that was already there, rather than kind of just outright overruling or changing the law that was already there. And so sometimes you can see a continuation. So Nihil Novi is nothing new without us. And kind of the original sense with that was, it was the nobility saying, we agree to work with the king as long as the king doesn't do anything too crazy or create laws without us. But in 1505, they probably didn't have the concept of a parliament as we would think of today, which is a regular or semi-regular meeting. It was just whenever a big event, a war, a crisis happens, the king has to act. So it was more of a kind of passive conception of consent, versus today we would have more of an active conception of consent. The government meets, the representatives meets, they vote a new law, the new law is created. Back then it was kind of like the king could do more or less whatever he wanted, unless he made the Schlachter mad, and then he kind of went too far. So the boundaries were kind of unclear. And so we saw, in some sense, the Henrician Articles took this principle from Nihil Novi, which is kind of this broad idea of the king cannot act without the consent of the nobility, and then actually made, here's the parliament. But, for example, it didn't say how often the parliament would meet, what they would talk about, how many members are elected to parliament, how often they're elected, and these were kind of the details that were filled in over time. But it also didn't destroy these kinds of legal acts that they kind of all added together. And a lot of customary law and local law were also kind of continued within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where you had different regions. And so one of the problems that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth have is they didn't have one kind of civil, or we call it civil code or criminal code, right, that united the whole country. They tried multiple times to have a codification. Sometimes the nobles would do it, and then the king would object and say, well, I don't like that, you're taking away my power. And then sometimes the king would try to do it, and then the noble says, we don't like that because then you're restricting what we can do. And so it kind of became, here's the king, and you have all these kind of local different laws and local different traditions, and the courts try to somehow balance between the two of them, but it was like there were kind of, some principles were very precise, some principles were more vague. Another principle we could say was there, but had to be, and some of these principles had to be tested. So, for example, this idea of ius residendi, right? That if the king goes too far, you can rebel against him. We see this all the way through the Jagiellonian period, where it's this kind of almost like a contract between the king and the nobility. that happens through, nihil novi, happens through these other legal acts. But how do you know when the king goes far? Do you make the king behave? Do you capture the king and behead him? Do you create a new king? These were kind of details that had to be worked out kind of over time. And we saw rebellions, and sometimes the rebellion would kind of be almost like a protest where they rebelled, they fight, they have a little battle. People would die on both sides, but it wasn't like a full revolution. The king would then compromise with the nobles, kind of like what happened with Magna Carta, kind of with England. This kind of the king and the nobility coming together. But a lot of these principles, another principle that arose later on was this idea of like the extraordinary same. So a crisis occurs. You have this regular parliamentary order, and then you also have this irregular parliamentary order. And a lot of these kind of special sames, so they have like pacification sames after a war. You have cases of interregna. There was no rule for, if the king dies, let's go through steps 1 through 5. Here's the end of the interregna. It was kind of this, the primate of Poland took over as interrex, but each time there's an interregna, they kind of had to have some kind of negotiation for the king. So there could be problems. That occurred multiple times throughout the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but there were always this kind of set of core principles that evolved, that the nation belongs to the Szlachta, that it's not the private property of the king, that the institutions don't belong to the king, so he can't do whatever he wants. The king is a citizen. Even the king has to obey the law. We're kind of consistent throughout this Commonwealth.
Well, it means that from this what you said, that we can make to the conclusions that everything in Poland, in the Commonwealth, was built on law, juridical norms, law norms.
Yeah, juridical norms, cultural norms as well, I think. But yes, I would argue that. And
this is, I think, a bit different. For example, in comparison with France, because the ancient French Constitution was a doctrine.
Yes. Yeah, so
the laws are going from doctrine.
The king is the state. Yes,
I
am the state. Yeah,
of course, but it was quite different situation. But it existed also in Europe, of course.
Yeah,
and there were strong researches about it, of course. But the grounds of this maybe not quite here, but I think that we have looked also. That's also very interesting questions. How far, these Polish experiences were compatible or maybe different, and maybe the same, like this what was made in the ancient tradition, that we can find, of course, different things about the constitutionalism in the ancient Rome, for example, but not only that. And the idea of republicanism, of course, that was made in the works of old Romans writers, especially Cicero, for example.
Yeah, Cicero Polybius. Yeah. But there's this book, book. It's like I think it's called Ancient Constitutionalism by Makiłła. I think it's 1940s or 50s that he wrote this. Where
what do you mean?
By Makiłła, where he talks about this, and also Skinner and Polka kind of they pick up
but about French constitutional
and Florentine
church.
Church. Yeah, but in Makiłła he actually goes back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and he kind of has this argument that where this word constitution kind of changed, and the same kind of etymological question kind of also exists in Poland as well. So when Poland today we have this word constitution, constitucja, which comes again from this Latin constitutio, and when the Sejm and the Sejmiki wrote, they called their legal acts constitutions, constitucja. But it's different from what we would think of today, where it's just, again, this kind of idea of the law behind the law. But what Makiłła's argument is that essentially what this happened in ancient Rome, when there's a transition from the Republican period to the when the emperors started to come. And so his argument is that the Greeks had this word politeia, which came from Aristotle, which can also be interpreted as a constitution. And a constitution is both an act, but a constitution is also kind of somehow the society. And so, like, if we think about the word constitution in English today, so we have a constitution as a legal act, but you could also say, for example, if somebody looks sick, you say, oh, he has a poor constitution. And the word constitution,
Organization, so.
yeah, you're right. Or constitution also is like, if something is the building block of something else. So like, what constitutes your theory is like, what are the parts of your theory? So this is this kind of ambiguity in this term, and this kind of comes from this Greek understanding of that. One sense, Aristotle uses politeia as a type of government, but on the other hand, he talks about as organization or society or something for the common good also. And so this use, according to Makiłła, was used all the way through Cicero and Polybius, but Cicero made speeches on this manner, and then it switched. And then when the emperor started to use, well, I'm writing the constitution, and then it became legal acts. And then through Roman law and through church law, through the medieval period, it was preserved in this sense. But in the 15th century, 16th century, we saw this revival of interest in classical republican ideas. So we have, from John Locke from America, and Baudin was an absolutist, but he engaged in part of this debates. Machiavelli, they started to say this word constitution, and then it went back to this word politeia again. So when we get to the American context, when we say constitution, we use the Latin word, but we use it in the Greek meaning of what the word originally meant. So this word constitution has and now today in this contemporary sense of constitution, most places around the world, they use constitution in the American sense, which was in some way was a reinvention of the Greek word. So this is kind of also why you have to look at the text of the Polish acts, because if you look at voluminum constitutionum or these legal acts or volumina legum, you're like, oh, the Polish constitution the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had 10,000 constitutions. Every time they met, they had another constitution, but it said the meaning of the word constitution kept changing. So you can't just take the words for their basis of what they mean. So it's this kind of debate. And interesting, if you look at the Third May Constitution, the Third May Constitution wasn't originally called the Third May Constitution. It was called the Act of the Government of Poland of the 3rd of May. And only later on, when they said, oh, this is the same thing that they're doing in America, then they started to change its name and call it the Third May Constitution. So this kind of ambiguity between politeia, constitutia, constitutionum, constitutions still kind of exists today. And so when we I kind of mentioned this earlier, the difference between a constitution and constitutionalism, in some sense, it kind of feels academic and just, oh, he's just talking about language and he just using kind of a different term. But in some sense, it's actually deeper than that, because there is this ambiguity in the language. And as the terms themselves have changed over the last 2,000 years, we have to be, or 2,500 years, so we include Greece, we have to be kind of very precise when we use these terms.
Yeah, Patrick, and in your book, you're also constantly present this interrelation mutual interrelation between political vote and institution and legal institution. Yes, that's a significant, let's say, part of this story which you've presented. And my question is, what about this Polish-Lithuanian political writers, thinkers? Whom of you you treat as your most favorite ones, and why?
So in the PhD and later in the book, I basically started with Andrzej Frycz-Modrzewski. It's kind of hard to not start with him. And then he kind of had this debates with Orzechowski as well. And then I had some thinkers in the middle, but towards the end, of course, he wasn't Poland in the sense as he came from Poland, but he was kind of forcibly adopted in, was of course Rousseau, right? Because Rousseau also has this very important book on basically where he gives his formula for what it would look like to kind of invent the Polish constitution, right? And so he was actually, during this kind of civil war in Poland, he was kind of invited by one of the sides to kind of rewrite it, what it looked like if they had won, and they ended up not winning the civil war. So it was kind of something like that. But the interesting thing about the Polish political thought is that it's really hard to kind of disconnect it with an overall kind of discourses about religion as well. So, for example, there were very so there's, for example, they have concerns about absolutism and they're worried about the Habsburgs. So the Habsburgs, during an interregna, they want to have their candidate or somebody kind of allied with them. Is it a question of they're worried about the absolutism of the Habsburgs? Is it they're worried that they are somehow a foreigner, or is it they're worried is that they're too Catholic? So it's hard, kind of hard to separate political thought from religious thought versus this other kind of movements as well, because like we said with the executionist movements, they also were very strongly connected with Protestantism. And even if, for example, like if you look at Mikołaj Żebrzydowski, right, and his writings or his speeches are given by Jan Czubek has this 3-volume series about them, and he's the political writings of this time. He was a Catholic, but he was afraid that the king was kind of trying to recombine the church, the Catholicism of the church, with his absolutist kind of power again. So the main religious figures that or political thinkers that we looked into was, of course, we had Fredro. I had Andrzej Frycz-Modzewski, Stanisław Orzechowski. I looked at Fredro. I looked at Szemek from our collection here. Then I looked at Żułkowski from the religious, Samuel Żułkowski from the religious side. But then I looked at, for the 18th century, we had Kołłątaj, Hugo Kołłątaj, Stanisław Staszic. We had I even had some quotes from Poniatowski in there as well, because Poniatowski is an interesting figure, and Richard Butterworth has written more about him than me. But Poniatowski was kind of an Anglophile, where he had spent some time in England and seen the works of Shakespeare, and I think there's a convincing argument that he wanted the Polish monarchy to look something like the British monarchy had, and it's hard to not kind of agree that maybe the system was evolving in that way. We don't know, or maybe the king was trying to push it in this kind of direction also. And so some, like I said, some minor figures, Rocco Szebrzydowski, and some quotes from other figures kind of interspersed without it. But those were the main list that I used.
And recently, you've also tried research the question of Strojnowski, yes, and his speech.
Strojnowski a little bit. We have a translation of some of his speech together a little bit, and there was his name is escaping me now, but he was the mentor of Mikołaj John. Was it John Lasky? Anyway, it was the mentor of Mikołaj Żebrzydowski, and he kind of inherited he was opposed to the king, and he kind of, his name is, I'm blanking on his name, but there are many figures who appear.
Yes, definitely.
Zamoyski.
Jan
Zamoyski. And so that's what it was. And Mikołaj Żebrzydowski kind of was his political student in some sense, and they kind of continued their skepticism of the king kind of throughout his work. But it's interesting kind of question to see from this hermeneutics point of view. Sometimes we go from text and we move forward, and sometimes we move from context and go backwards, and we have this dialogue. So, for example, the turn of the 17th century in Poland, about a third of the Szlachta, and we saw some senators and castellans and voivodes and things were Protestant. So the Reformation was successful in Poland. Then you had thinkers or people who were religious, who then got into power to then defend their positions and defend their own religion. So it wasn't like these principles of religious toleration in Poland maybe didn't appear kind of out of nowhere, but there was some way this idea of protection of regional rights, this idea of protection of religious rights, was somehow kind of a reflection of the social diversity and the kind of the political conversations of life that was just happening at the time anyway. So sometimes it's hard to say, well, was the politics reacting to the social life, or a social life reacting to the political life, and the laws would reflect that kind of dynamic that they had.
And Patrick, as we are approaching probably to the end, yes, of this.
Not quite.
So what you could find, what you could point as a lasting legacy of this Polish-Lithuanian old, early modern constitutionalism?
Well, one of the things that I'm kind of interested is, well, though the easy answer is republicanism. The second, then also this idea of religious toleration, it was unique for that. But I'm also trying to dig through and find kind of maybe some empirical, some kind of practical things to consider today. You know, how can today's democracies maybe be improved by studying the Polish democracy? And I'm really fascinated by this Sejmiki system, that we could say that it was unique in the sense that the nobility would, as I guess back to track and explain it to make it kind of more interesting, is that there was these regional Sejms or parliaments called the Sejmiki, Sejmiki. Then they would vote representatives, and then the representatives would go to the general Sejm. So it's kind of this kind of composite democracy representative system, which is similar to what we have, for example, in the United States, where we have both regional politics within the state level, but then we also represent people to the overall level, national level. But what's the interesting thing was that after the parliament, the main parliament, which moved around, so if it was in Warsaw or Lithuania or wherever it was, then they would have come together, and then the people who were elected from the local parliaments would have to come back and kind of give a report on how they voted and why they voted, and then the local government could say, well, we told you, and there's actually these things called the instructions or instructia, the instructions they gave them said, oh, the king really wants to have a war with Moscow, so whatever you do, don't raise taxes. And so sometimes the king would try to raise taxes, and they said no, and they vote down, and that's the end of the Sejm. Sometimes the king was able to say, well, if you vote for me, I'll make you voivode, and then they would change their minds. And so, but there was this interesting dynamic where they would have to go back and kind of report on what they did. And then if the local parliament didn't like the decision that they made, they could say, okay, you betrayed our trust, you can't run for office anymore. And that's something that I think we're kind of lacking, because in the kind of the contemporary theory of political science is that this idea that elections is like a marketplace. You go, you run. If you're unpopular, well, then the next cycle, they just vote you out. And so the kind of the election is seen as the process of the will of the people. But Poland kind of had that extra step in there, whereas between the election, or between the end of parliament and between the next election, they kind of had a new session where then there's kind of a local cycle. So you had these national cycles and kind of these local cycles, and they came together. And so my kind of question is, and we have to look through the local records of parliament, administrative records, and I'm kind of going through these actually right now. Was this threat of, we elected you to do this thing, to represent us. If then you deviate from what we said when you get to the national parliament, was this an effective threat? Was it just kind of a theory? How often was it exercised? Can we see these kinds of cases? Because all political systems kind of have this problem. I mean, could you imagine what it would be like today if Poland elected somebody to go to the EU Parliament, and then they say, we're going to promise to do one thing. They get to the EU Parliament and they say, now I'm in Parliament and now I vote for something else. And then they come back to Poland, and Poland people say, okay, you're banned from the EU Parliament, right? Or same thing with America. The senator says, I'm going to not vote for war with Venezuela or whatever. And then Donald Trump declares war with Venezuela. And then they say they go for it. And then they go back home and the people said, we told you not to declare war. You break our trust. Now you're not allowed to be a senator anymore. It's kind of an external level of democracy, an external kind of check and balance. And because I think there's a tendency over time, even America, that kind of started as a very decentralized country. And over time, we're becoming more and more centralized. And I think that some of these mechanisms that the Polish-Lithuanian, as we said, this is the problem, maybe a weakness of the Polish-Lithuanian government, where they had too much power with the local authorities over the central government. But I think a lot of these problems with corruption and getting into wars and things like that, if there's more mechanisms to hold politicians accountable to the people, I think that would be a better thing. So that's what I'm trying to look at as the court cases and the records where the Polish they're afraid that their representatives would just do whatever they wanted, and so were there actually mechanisms that they made that worked, and were they effective? And for example, Kłąta and Staszic, as again, they wanted to go further than the Third Maid, which they did. They said, we want to make it by law that if you are elected to do a certain thing and given a certain set of instructions, it's now illegal for you to vote against the will of the people who elected you. And the Supreme Court actually had a decision a few years ago with the case of Donald Trump, where people were in the Electoral College, which is a whole different caveat, but the point is that people were elected to Donald Trump, or maybe it was Hillary Clinton. Anyway, the point is that you're supposed to vote for your state. So the state of New York votes for Hillary Clinton. Everybody who's representative is supposed to vote for them, and several of them didn't. They said, we're not going to vote for Hillary Clinton anyway. And the Supreme Court said, you're actually punishable by law for that. So we did kind of see this mechanism where the court said, you're supposed to do one thing and you voted something else, and you can actually be held accountable as a court case like that. And so I haven't seen something equivalent to that in Poland, but maybe digging into these records with the tribunal and some of these court cases, that maybe there was some court cases about this.
Yeah. So, I think that it was very interesting story what you deliver us, and I would like to thank you very much, Patrick, because
Thanks for having
we
me.
started with discussion about John Patrick Higgins, Dr. John Patrick Higgins, the Hermeneutics of Polish-Lithuanian Constitutionalism, 1374 to 1792. But it was the start for different other discussions and notes about constitutionalism all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to once more to thank you very much, and also you for the attention, and to the next time. We'll be returned soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.